Good morning and welcome to the daily chapter reading of The Gift of Anger, Aaron Gandhi. Lesson 10, You Will Be Tested. The 2 years I spent with Bapuji on the Sevagram ashram were a crucial time in both his life and world history. All the political reinforcements in India were coming to a boil. The country was getting closer to achieving independence from Britain, but Bapuji's hope for a united country where people of all religions and castes could live together harmoniously were being dashed at every turn. An idea that had been forged a decade earlier of creating a separate Muslim state out of some of India's northern provinces. The country would be called Pakistan, which means land of the pure. Bapuji was ardently opposed to the partition. One of the leaders of the partition movement was a Muslim named Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Like Bapuji, he had started his career as a lawyer in London, but he had never given up his proper name, some would say arrogant, bearing. He fought hard against Bapuji. So many people were shocked when, as independence drew closer, Bapuji proposed to Britain's Lord Mountbatten, the last viceroy of India, that Jinnah should become independent India's first prime minister. Bapuji thought this was the only way to win the trust of the Muslim minority and preserve a united country. His suggestion was pretty spectacular when you think about it. American politicians care so much about being in power that they are willing to stop legislation, stonewall Supreme Court appointments, and even shut down the government to feed their own egos and war chests. Bapuji was willing to say that the good of the country should be above all personal feelings and desires. Lord Mountbatten later said he was staggered by the proposal, but that it wasn't the time for idealistic action. He needed to move forward with a steady plan. Nehru would become Prime Minister and Jinnah the leader of Pakistan. Bapuji felt cut out of the complicated negotiations and head to another part of the country to try to stop some of the bloody fighting between Hindus and Muslims that were leaving corpses scattered in the streets. On June 3rd, 1947, negotiations came to an end and the agreement was signed. India was free of British rule, but it was now divided into two countries. The approaching partition sparked increasingly violent clashes between Hindu and Muslim radicals. Instead of joyously anticipating India's August 15th Independence Day, my grandfather was heartbroken. The mass disruption of the country was already starting. Ultimately, the partition would lead to the largest migration in world history, with some 15 million people trying to escape the sectarian violence. In early August, Bapuji made plans to head to other parts of the country to try to end some of the violence and bloodshed. People from Calcutta to Delhi feared that the religious massacres would intensify even further. I wanted to go with him on the trip, but for once Bapuji didn't agree. It is not the place for young people, he told me. So I remained behind while Bapuji went to cities being torn apart by riots, whose residents were fearful of what would happen to them with their families after partition. He was stunned by the explosions of anger. When his train stopped in Calcutta, the local officials, afraid that the violence would get even worse, begged him to stay until Independence Day. He agreed on the condition that he and the Muslim League's chief minister, Hussein Shahid Suhrawardy, sleep under the same roof. Adversity makes for strained bedfellows, he said, but instead of a joke, it was a masterful strategy. If the most famous Hindu in the world and the most prominent Muslim in the region could offer this show of unity, wouldn't the masses in the street respond by giving up some of their violence and bloodshed? They went together to a home that had been looted and stood empty in a neighborhood destroyed by ethnic fighting. At first, my grandfather was surrounded by angry mobs, and he thought the furious people would kill him. But his calm words with Suhrawardy at his side had an astonishing effect. On August 15th, instead of more horrific killing in Calcutta, people marched through the street chanting, "Hindus and Muslims are brothers." People in the crowd threw rose petals at my grandfather. Lord Mountbatten congratulated Bapuji on the miracle of Calcutta and admitted that he had established an oasis of peace where the military had failed. Amid all the turmoil and bloodshed, it was a great statement on the power of nonviolence. Meanwhile, across the country in Delhi, the new Prime Minister raised the flag of a free India for the first time. If credit is due to any man today, it is to Gandhiji, he told the huge cheering crowd. I was with my family that day in Bombay. Millions of people came out to march in parade and dance in the streets, but out of respect for my grandfather, none of our extended family participated. I don't see any reason to rejoice, Bapuji had said. Some of us children and teenagers went out to see the lights and hear the noise. I remember being torn by the excitement all around me and the sadness I had seen in Bapuji's eyes when he realized that his plea against partition would not be heeded. His colleagues had abandoned him in their rush to get into power. He saw partition as the negation of all he stood for. It would encourage more divisiveness between people and, as it was quickly becoming obvious, would lead to an unprecedented massacre of innocent people on both sides. In the following days, Bapuji continued to visit one village after another, pleading for sanity and peace. But even he couldn't hold back the roaming gangs who began killing again. Panicked refugees fled in all directions. There were reports from one town that a line of people trying to escape on foot stretched over 50 miles. Bapuji made his way to Delhi and maintained his calm demeanor even as the violence moved closer and people in Lord Mountbatten's own house were murdered. The mayhem and upheaval in the country were tragic proof to my grandfather of what happens when nonviolence and satyagraha are forgotten. With so much uncertainty in the country, my parents thought it was time for all of us to return to South Africa. In those days, the sea voyage from India to South Africa took 21 days, sometimes longer. The first passage we could get was in early November, nearly 3 months away. Father wrote Bapuji of the plan and he sent his blessings to all of us. Then he sent some special words to me. "Do not forget what I have taught you, a run my grandfather revoked. I hope you will continue working for peace when you grow up." I had learned so much in our 2 years together and I stood a little taller at his words of encouragement. I didn't realize they were the last he would ever give me. In the 2 years that I had been with Bapuji, he had been a positive and transforming force in India, and he had inspired similarly dramatic changes in me. I no longer felt angry all the time, and when I was angry, I knew how to redirect it to do good. I could be the positive spark of electricity in the world. I had learned the nuances of nonviolence, and just as Bapuji hoped, I want to dedicate myself to fighting bigotry and discrimination and all the inequalities that lead to violence in the world. The journey home was long, but it wasn't as harrowing as our arrival. I smiled when I remembered my exhausting walk that first day from the Wardha train station to Sevagram. Now, as I was leaving, I was still a teenager with much to prove to myself and others, but I would never again let my ego rule my common sense. I had earned that about humility and that you prove yourself by your heart and your actions. Back in South Africa, at last, my parents told me that a school had opened for the Indian community just a few miles from where we lived on the Phoenix Ashram. I never had to go to the terrible convent school again or deal with the punishment of nuns. My sister Ella and I began to attend together rather than traveling the 17 miles into the city each day. All that was good, but it still felt strange to be back in South Africa. I had become an entirely new person in 2 years. My parents' home on the Phoenix Ashram offered more comforts than I'd had at Sevagram and better food, but my heart was still in India with my grandfather and I thought often about going back. But a reunion would never occur. On January 30th, 2 months after I left him, the unthinkable happened. Ella and I were walking home from school, making our way along the muddy track created by the trucks and tractors of the farmers working the land. It was a hot day and a tall sugar cane surrounded us. We hadn't gotten very far when Ella protested that she couldn't go any farther. With a sigh, she sat down on the ground. "I'm not walking anymore. You'll have to carry me," she demanded. Before my education from Bapuji, I would have tugged her along or gotten angry at her childishness. She was 6 years younger than I, but now I knew to handle the situation with respect and understanding. "I am not carrying you, so I will just have to leave you here," I said calmly. I wasn't really going to leave her, so I simply stood. That's when I noticed an older man who lived in our Phoenix ashram walking rapidly toward us. He almost never left the ashram grounds, so I was very surprised to see him. I wondered where he was headed. It took me a moment to realize that he was coming in search of us. When he got close, he called out to me with panting urgency, "Aaron, run home immediately. Your mother needs you. I will bring your sister." "I am already heading home. What's the rush?" I asked. "Just go, run. Don't argue. Your mother needs you." I realized something very serious had happened. I ran home and found my mother on the phone, heaving with sobs. She hung up when I came in, but the phone rang. She answered it but could barely speak. In between the tears and phone calls, she managed to sputter out the horrible truth she had just learned. My beloved grandfather had been murdered. "We will never see him again," my mother cried. I was stunned. I asked where my father was. "He went to town this morning for a meeting, and I don't know how to get in touch with him." She kept trying to talk to me, but the phone kept ringing and ringing as more people heard the news and called to share their horror and dismay. I stood in the midst of the cacophony and began to weep. All the moments of the 2 years I lived with him flashed in my mind. Racing at the spinning wheel, swinging him from my shoulder, the caress of his hand on my cheek when I tried to make him laugh. It was not possible that he was gone. "How could anyone kill Bapuji?" I asked my mother. I knew that there had been many assassination attempts on him in the past, often by right-wing Hindus who thought he had betrayed them, but he had survived them all. I thought he was indestructible. My father soon arrived home, ashen and holding back his tears. He had finished his meeting and been in the market buying fruit when he heard of the awful news. Some of the vendors had offered to drive him home, but my father had managed to keep his composure and get back to us. He hugged my mother and held us close. The house became more and more chaotic as close friends learned of the assassination and came over. "Is it really true?" each would ask. My father tried to reach his brother in India to get more details, but it took a while to get through. Telecommunications were primitive where we lived, and the call had to be placed through a series of operators. When he did get connected, the line was shaky, but my father managed to convey that he wanted to come for the funeral. My uncle said there was no time. Bapuji was assassinated at 5:16 in the evening, and within a few hours, nearly 1 million people had descended on New Delhi. Officials feared that if they delayed the funeral, half of India would turn up and there would be riots. My uncle had agreed to arrange the funeral for the following afternoon. We would have to say goodbye from 5,000 miles away. The next day, along with my parents, I listened to the funeral proceedings over a crackling radio. I learned that my grandfather had been staying at Birla House in Delhi, the same place I had once stayed with him. He had strolled into the garden to lead a prayer meeting with his grandnieces at his side as his walking sticks. As the crowd parted for him, a man rushed forward and pushed aside the woman next to my grandfather, the place where the last 2 years I could most often be found. He shot Bapuji 3 times. Many world leaders want to attend the funeral, but like us, they weren't able to arrive in time. The Pope sent a tribute, as did President Harry Truman and King George IV. More than 1.5 million Indians of every religion, caste, and color joined the funeral procession. Likely the same number watched from vantage points around the city. Perhaps the most stunning tribute was when the violence in India came to an abrupt halt. Someone described it as being like the throwing of a switch. With the news of his death, the rampant killing end, and suddenly Babaji's dream of peace and unity seemed possible after all. But for me, listening to the radio commentary from thousands of miles away didn't bring any peace at all. I tried to envision what was happening, and my initial shock and sadness turned to anger. As we clustered around the radio, I finally exploded. If I had been at Birla House, I would have throttled the person who shot Babaji. I would have killed him, I said furiously. My father wiped tears from his eyes and looked at me with great seriousness. Have you already forgotten the lessons your grandfather taught you? He asked quietly. He was sad, but I heard the great compassion in his voice. Then, as Babaji would do, my father pulled me to him. Did he not say we must use anger intelligently? What would be the best use of the anger you feel now? I thought for a moment and took a deep breath. To work like he did to stop violence in the world. My father nodded. That's right. Never forget his lessons. The best thing we can all do for Babaji is to continue his mission and dedicate our lives to seeing that tragedies like this don't happen again. My father knew that I needed an outlet for my anger, and a positive action can often push away negative thoughts. We decided to plan our own memorial service to help ourselves as well as the legions of mourners in South Africa. My father suggested we put together a special memorial issue of the Indian Opinion Orphans, started by Babaji and continued as a weekly by my father. He got people to share memories and photographs with us, and we researched my grandfather's life. Within a month, we had a special 100-page commemorative issue printed on a primitive hand-operated press. The project redirected our minds from grief and anger, demanding instead our love and warm attention. I looked with pride at the issue we created and turned the pages over and over, thinking about my grandfather, but I couldn't stop myself from replaying the shooting in my mind and imagining myself at Babaji's side. Could I have stopped the gunman? I wish I could kill that murderer right now, I told my parents one day. My mother sighed. She knew how I felt, but she also knew that my grandfather would not appreciate the sentiment. Your grandfather would want you to forgive the person who did this, she said quietly. Her words caught me up short. Of course, that was what Babaji would have wanted. Instead of offering forgiveness to the killer, I wanted revenge. But I knew Babaji would say that revenge is never the right solution. A desire for revenge eats away at you, destroying your peace of mind and leaving you constantly on edge. Instead of hurting you once, the evildoer takes over your life and it destroys you again and again. I couldn't let that happen, or I would be letting Babaji down. Babaji had taught me that nonviolence was not the same as passivity or cowardice. It's acceptable to use limited force to disarm aggressors and protect the ones you love. If I had been one of his walking sticks that day, Babaji would have wanted me to tackle his would-be killer and not just run away. But I hadn't been there, and now the question was how to respond to what had already occurred. Forgiveness is more manly than punishment, Babaji had said. When we are tested, we don't prove our strength with violence or anger, but by directing our actions for good. India had given Babaji the great gift of brief peace after his death. I had to give the similar gift of forgiveness in the face of great evil. Babaji had once explained that it is easy to love those who love you, but the real power of nonviolence comes when you can love those who hate you. I know how difficult it is to follow this grand law of love, he had said, but we are not all great and good things difficult to do. Love of the hater is the most difficult of all. But even this most difficult thing becomes easy to accomplish if you want to do it. He was right that it was difficult to find forgiveness, but I knew I had to do it, both for myself and for him. It would be my tribute to our 2 years together. I remembered again how my grandfather liked to say that an eye for an eye just makes the whole world blind. We need to redefine what we mean by justice. Our goal after a tragedy should be to see how we can make the world better, not to prove that we can descend into more violence and revenge. And so in the years since my grandfather died, I have dedicated myself to spreading his message of forgiveness and hope and nonviolence. Unfortunately, tragedies continue. With every senseless murder in America, my adopted country, friends, and family members are left with the same torment and pain that I experienced that day by the radio. I spent many years grappling with the question of how we should respond dozen students were killed at Columbine High School in Colorado in what was then the deadliest school shooting in American history. A friend of mine in the area asked what I speak to the survivors. Everyone was angry and wanted revenge. Shortly before the meeting, my friend asked me what I intend to say. I will talk about forgiveness and moving on with their lives, I replied. If you do that, they'll throw you out of the room, he warned me. They are too angry to hear that. But I stood up before the group and spoke about nonviolence and shared the lessons of forgiveness I had learned from my parents and grandparents. I told them I understood their pain and anguish because I had experienced it. I urged them to move ahead and to try to fill their hearts with love instead of hate because it was the only way to a better society. Instead of being thrown out of the auditorium, I got a standing ovation. More recently, in 2014, I found myself once again addressing a crowd of mourners. This time it was in Ferguson, Missouri, after the killing of an 18-year-old black man by a white police officer led to the charges of racial discrimination. A huge group had gathered to show their solidarity, and they read aloud the names of the 110 people murdered in Ferguson that year. There was anger in the crowd, and the speakers emphasized the need for whites to acknowledge the prejudices they wittingly or unwittingly harbored against blacks. With all the finger pointing about who was in the wrong, I suddenly felt as though I were back at my mother's side hearing her tell us children, when you point a finger at someone, you have three fingers pointing back at you. Instead of looking for what others have done wrong, we need to look at ourselves. When it was my turn to speak, I tried to channel Babaji and find a positive outlet for the crowd's anger. I wanted to help them heal, but I also challenged them to move beyond vengeance. Prejudice exists in every of us, whatever our color or race, I said. Unless we are willing to recognize this weakness in our character, we will never change. We transform the world only when we face challenges with love and kindness rather than hatred and meanness. I shared with them Babaji's most important words. We must be the change we see. I saw nods in the crowd and murmurs of understanding. I was moved that these grieving people could still be touched by Babaji's powerful message and understand his call to look beyond labels and to find the good in everyone. The power of my grandfather's lesson can inspire all of us in good times and bad, and his light of hope will continue to shine. If we want this world to change, we have to change ourselves. If we want peace in the world, we have to find peace in ourselves.